Dr. Alexandra Macht is an independent researcher in Romania, and you're going to say something about the role of love and children's agency in improving fathers' well-being. Is that right? Is that okay?
Yes,
all right.
Perfect. Thank
okay.
you.
Okay.
So first of all, I do want to thank you very much for inviting me as part of your conference. I do think that the topic is timely and important, and I'm very happy to be sharing with you some of the modest results of my research. This is a piece of research that was conducted at the University of Edinburgh as part of my doctorate, and it was based on qualitative interviews, 47 of them, with Scottish and Romanian fathers of a variety of cultural backgrounds. And for example, I had fathers of different classes, I have fathers of different professions and different relational situations. So some of them were married, others were in separations, a couple of them were divorced as well. And I had a wide age range as well. The youngest father in my sample was 28 years old and the oldest was 56 years old. But I think I got a bit too, too quickly into the methodological aspects of this research. I do need to say that I'm a social psychologist, so this presentation and the work that I have been doing has this sociological bias, if you choose to call it in this way. But at the same time, at my heart, at my training, I am a psychologist, and I approached the interviews, the qualitative interviews, in a way in which allowed space for men to bring in considerations of how they were approaching their masculinity in dialogue with this new fathering role that they were embodying, or more like a continuation of their fathering role for those of them that had children previously. And the interviews were very rich. I was actually impressed by how much they were able to talk once the initial ice was broken, and how eager some of them were to talk about the subject, because most of them were never even asked about the emotional aspects of their fathering role. So basically, I adopted something called grounded theory methodology, the adapted version of cat teacher Maz, and I allowed fathers the space to bring up a lot of their own experiences, just gently nudging them and trying not to stick to a strict qualitative interview schedule, trying to put myself in the listener and observer part. And I think this is where my psychotherapeutic training came into place, because I wanted to just create this holding space where they were able to safely talk about their emotional experiences, both the negative emotional experiences, but also the more positive ones. So it was interesting because they started describing this really beautiful world of intimacy with their children that was somehow limited by how other people perceive them, by in many cases their own ways of internalizing and externalizing emotions. And it was an intimate world that was populated with moments of doubt and of worries, a world that was also flanked by using power and anger in order to control situations with their children. And it was interesting from the point of view that in this world, they described the child as an agent. So somebody that had authority from time to time, somebody that would challenge them. It wasn't necessarily that the child was just an emotional subordinate to the father, but it was most likely a dialogue. And in certain cases, children themselves, regardless of gender, had the capacity to make fathers become aware of their own scary behaviors or controlling behaviors. Now, I do need to mention that I've published quite widely the results of this research, and a couple of things emerged as part of this research. And I mean, I'm looking forward to the Q&A portion where I hope to be able to take on your questions. Because at the moment in this stage, I feel like I've completely wrapped up this research. Very recently, there was a volume of edited research that was just published 2 weeks ago, actually. It's called Engaged Fatherhood. And I reflected on the results of basically the final portion of the results that appeared from my doctoral work in that specific chapter. So at the moment, I do think that this research is kind of moving itself into some sort of conclusion at the moment. But as I said, I'm looking forward to the questions you might have. So I do want to bring it back right now to the concept that I found out based on the analysis of the data. It's a concept that I called emotional bordering, in order to describe this work, the emotional work that fathers were doing in relation to their children, but also in relation to their own partner and to the images that they have of their own fathers. Because my research and in my interviews, I asked them about love for their own father and mother and how they were brought up, and how it is different from love from their partner and love for their children. So I explored these three different avenues, and interesting things emerge, such as the fact that fathers adopted three different pathways in which they could reconcile the tensions between their masculine role, or how they perceive themselves as men, and the fathering role, and the increasing pressure that they felt towards becoming more nurturing and more caring. And some of them were trying to conform to images of traditional masculinity, while others were actively rebelling against this idea that a man should be tough and stoic and simply the provider. And the strategies that I could identify were based on the bordering that they were applying. So for example, some fathers that were more progressive and they were very eagerly embracing this idea of a nurturing, caring, involved father, they actively tried to not fall into the role of the father, the traditional archetype of the father, which was this idea of being an authoritarian, stoic father. These men were in conflict most often with their own fathers, and they tried to become aware of these patterns that more or less were sabotaging them. At least this is how they described themselves during my interviews.
Yeah, aspetta temprano porque mi compu está.
So would you mute your mic, please? Whoever that is, I can't see. Doesn't matter. Yes, please.
It's already happening.
Yeah, it's been happening.
Would you mute, please? Thank you. No, not you, not you. I just the other, just to let the person who's talking.
Yeah.
No, not you. Okay.
Robert.
No problem. Okay, so as I mentioned, some fathers, involved fathers, were setting their emotional borders in a much lower way. If you could imagine this emotional border as a way in which their stoicism was enacted when they were becoming very basically like they erected a border between themselves and other people, and they were trying to emotionally detach. So that was one end of emotional strategy that they were adopting. So they were much more higher on the stoical part, while certain fathers were ambivalent. They were placed in the middle. They wanted to become more nurturing and more intimate, but found themselves unconsciously falling into these traditional patterns when they raise their voice at their children, or when they prioritize drinks with their workmates rather than coming home and taking care of the child. While others were, as I mentioned before the interruption, they were actively trying to put forth this idea that no, a man should be caring and vulnerable, and I resent how I was raised by my own parents, and thereby I want to put a different image. Some of these fathers as well, it emerged that they had, so the fathers in this group that was trying to be very low on their emotional bordering. So they tried to create intimacy, tenderness, and moments of vulnerability between themselves and their children. They actually really disliked even the name father. They wanted to be seen more as the friends of their children, because it emerged for a couple of them during the interviews that they had experienced physical abuse and punishment at the hands of their own fathers. So they didn't want to associate themselves with such a toxic and negative form of masculinity that was performed in their own family of origin. So I tried my best to try to reconcile the concepts that exist in both the psychological literature with Michael Lamb and his idea of involved fatherhood that is with us in the literature since the 1980s, with more recent sociological literature that was talking about a variety of forms of masculinities, ranging from elite masculinities, working class masculinities, to toxic forms of masculinity, and to the more progressive idea of caring and nurturing masculinity. So I was trying to reconcile these aspects and trying to understand, yes, but for a man, what is this? What is the basically the experience of transforming or thinking about their masculinity in relation to fathering as a role? Because it's interesting that in the literature we have a variety of different forms of describing masculinity, but fathering tends to remain caught between these two extremes, either nurturing or traditional. And traditional is seen many times as something quite negative, so to say, something caught up in a world that no longer fits into the current fluid modernity, digitalization of parent-child relationships, so on and so forth. So I would like to focus now in this part of my presentation on some of the quotes that appeared from my research and how I think that it emerged very sweetly how fathers were describing their children as agents, so as individuals that basically were not just conforming to what their parents were saying, but were kind of helping them actively consider their own health and well-being. Because this is the point I'm trying to make in this research, and the point I'm making in the chapter that was recently published as part of the edited collection, Engaged Fatherhood. It was interesting to see how it emerged, because I wasn't specifically asking fathers about health and well-being, but it just emerged out of the grounded theory nature of my qualitative interviews, that fathers saw their children as a potential way of becoming better men. So not only doing their part as a father and living up to their responsibilities, but also having this understanding that my children, irrespective of their gender, are somehow contributing to me making certain changes in my life, or at least these are the self-reported ways in which they talked about it. So children, through their mere presence, were engaging fathers in ceasing things such as drug use, losing weight, or driving more carefully. Some fathers explained that these changes happened as they became fathers and realized that they had to remain healthy and present in their children's life for longer. So, for example, Stephen, a Scottish father, he was 35 years old and self-identified as a part-time dad. This is exactly the way that he filled up the questionnaire, the demographic questionnaire I offered him. He was talking about how having his daughter changed his life by helping him get motivated to let go of drugs. So here, in his own words, she changed my whole life around. I was on drugs, other stuff, and now because of her, I'm not on drugs. And that's because of myself, realistically, because I choose not to be anymore. I'm quite strong-minded that way when it comes to my daughter. You want her to look up to you and say, that's my daddy. In addition to this, Mark, who was a middle-class father from the same sample of Scottish men and of a similar age to Stephen, working as a team leader for a company, he describes how becoming a father made him aware that he had to be available for long term, and therefore he cut back on his smoking. So that probably scares me quite a lot as well, that I don't particularly look after myself. I think I'd be devastating that what I did to myself meant he didn't have to have me around. So that's something I need to change as well, and I am gradually. But it's a good thing. He has helped me cut down on smoking a lot. Now, obviously, I wasn't testing the verity of these affirmations and not really doing observations to see if indeed fathers have changed their behaviors. But there is something here about the ways in which fathers were thinking of themselves as healthier individuals due to the fact that they had a child, and the fact that this child has a transformative effect on them, not just that they were using their parental power to raise this individual being to either conform to social norms or somehow rebel against them. And lastly, Emil, a Romanian 37-year-old executive director, so also part of the more middle-class strata of society, reflected on how having 2 daughters made him aware of needing to lose weight to maintain his health, as well as driving more carefully. So in his own words, since I had the girls, I became very careful with myself. I started losing weight. I realized that they need me long-term, and I have to behave in such a way so as not to endanger myself. Up until they were born, I used to drive around like a madman. Now I'm more careful behind the wheel. I drive slowly, and not only when I'm in the car with them, also when I'm by myself. I think because I'm more aware now that I have to remain available for the long term. So
You've got 4 minutes left. Just let me know.
Great, wonderful. I'm just about to wrap it up. So briskly making use of this time, and thank you so much for giving me the space to argue for this argument. It's basically, I'm speaking here that involved fatherhood offers men the opportunity to resist risk-taking practices. So these risk-taking practices in the literature and in the research that I was able to analyze and study are intrinsically linked to traditional images of what it means to be a tough man. These images, which are also harmful to men's well-being. So this incipient data, because I wish I had collected more data, but the incipient data that emerged from my research certainly needs more development in the future. And I do hope that some of the data I have published and I presented in this research today can open up the conversation for future potential avenues of how we can continue to research the links between masculinity and fathering. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much. It's very, very glad you could present your research. There are of course a lot of things. I mean, what you're saying about the child as agent, and I think the idea that the children somehow they contribute that they make quite a difference to the father and how the father sees himself. I think it's really very important, particularly for me anyway. But want to throw it open, of course, to the whole Zoom conference and see if people have comments or questions.
Yeah, are you going to go first, Tony? Do you want to go?
There's Richard and Tony. I think which one of you?
You go, Tony. I've already spoken. You say something.
No, I was just going. I actually can't see that, and all I see is a blank screen. I don't know what's going on here. Anyway, I was just going to say, yeah, I have a daughter, and she's certainly had an agency upon me, but really challenging my own ideas of being a father, or what the hell is a father? It's kind of terrifying being a father, I think. Especially if you're trying to be a good one, or you're trying to think of, but I think that's a really interesting idea, that the child as agent, but I'm not sure if it happens in lots of families. I work in kind of social care area, and I think there's lots of families where the child is not the agent, it sounds a kind of an unusual situation for a father to be very responsive to a child.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. I don't know if I didn't maybe miss this point, Alexandra, which I enjoyed listening to you. But how did you go about finding your participants for this study? Did you talk about that? Because I also had my immediate thoughts were listening to that I wish my dad had been maybe even part of this conference today. He's very busy with doing something else, let's say. But yeah, did you talk about that? Or?
No, I haven't. So thank you very much for this question. Just to answer the first comment, I think that the idea of intimate fathering, so this more progressive form of fathering that we seem to be collectively in social policy and in sociology trying to push towards, is actually more about creating the space for the child to express their agency rather than truly just a certain sample of men out there are respecting the agency while others are not. So it's more about basically through this self-awareness, men working on themselves to try to allow children to express this agency. But yes, I do need to say that this sense of agency didn't emerge from all of the interviews I was conducting. And I do think that it is something that is seen more as a progressive ideal in certain households than a reality, unfortunately. Now, collecting or finding my participants, I used snowball sampling, and I allowed men to self-identify as involved. I began by doing, first of all, by asking friends of my friends. So if they had other family friends that I wasn't aware of before, and if they had children, and if they consider themselves to be involved fathers, because that was the important aspect. I was looking specifically for involved fathers. I was testing this concept of Michael Lamb, involved fathering. And basically, I thought that by using snowball sampling, by having this social reflection of the fact that, oh, here's James, and he's a really good father, you should talk to him. It was in a way validating this identity that they are involved fathers indeed. So it's not just them saying in a questionnaire, I am an involved father, but it's also how people around them were seeing them. Although you could argue that being friends with somebody does introduce that bias as well. And certainly I'm not saying that the way I collected my data is the epitome of perfection, but I do think that this helped in a way. So I put out notice boards as well, and I collected information, and I got into this snowball sampling with in Scotland with men from enterprises, so men that were working in for institutions, for social institutions. And then I also recruited men through organizations that were helping fathers get on the right track after a variety of social issues. That's how I got my working class sample and my middle class sample in Scotland. And in Romania, the snowball sampling worked so well, I got my sample quite quickly. So by word of mouth, I asked my friends, and then fathers were telling me about other fathers that they know or that they worked with or that they had their children playing with their other children. So that was basically how I collected.
Right. Del, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Alexandra. I've got two questions, really. Maybe difficult questions, perhaps. I don't know what you think. Hopefully.
Okay.
It's really, with regard to involved fathers and the people around them. Yep. And I'm delighted in your you're saying that how important children are in counteracting toxic aspects of masculinity. But I wondered to what extent, one, you came across anything with regard to the involved father. What about sexuality? What about the father's sexual stirrings, perhaps with children, as children grow up to be adolescents? Did you research? Was that a sort of something that just never reared its ugly head in your research? And the second question really is with regard to those men who have not got children and are not members of extended families. Yeah, I often feel so sorry for them as to how they can be with children without being regarded as paedophiles, etc. Yeah. And so there's the two questions really. One is with regard to being an involved father and sexuality, and the second is with regard to those men who have not got children or children of near relatives, and how can one enable them to develop and pleasure as humans with children in our society that is so terrified of men and children?
Yes, well, part of my development of this concept of emotional bordering actually stemmed from a couple of quotes, primarily from Scottish fathers, regarding the shadow of the pedophile. So it was this understanding of being together in an intimate setting, such as giving the child a bath or just being by themselves on a couch watching a movie. And certain fathers talked about, sometimes you are afraid that it might cross a certain border, that it might loom into something else. And most of the ones that actually reflected on this were much more aware of how the media or other people were kind of placing these ideas in their minds, this idea that, things should never cross a certain boundary, that you always need to be somehow on guard, even when you're trying to be vulnerable and tender, and you're sharing some sort of legitimate form of intimacy with your children. But it was highly socially controlled, and especially it emerged from interviews with Scottish fathers. Romanian fathers didn't really talk that much about this, but they talked about these unconscious forces that would sometimes creep up in their relation to their child regarding violence. So Scottish fathers were much more concerned about the sexual aspect because of the fact that in the media, pedophile had such a strong impact, while Romanian fathers were much more concerned about violence and not wanting to lash out on their children and slapping them or smacking them when they least expected it, because their own fathers used a lot of physical discipline to raise them into what it means to be a good father or a good man, which was equated for the majority of Romanian fathers with this stoic, emotionally controlled, traditionally providing role. So some of them were aware of this and they were trying to work through. But as I mentioned, with the ambivalent group, the one in the middle, I thought that they were the most interesting, to be honest, because they were trying to be nurturing and progressive, but as I said, they caught themselves, either their own partner was mentioning that, hey, you lost your temper there, or hey, that was a little bit, out of a context, you need to control your emotions right now with the child. So they had these unconscious moments when past behaviors or past patterns that they were trying to move away from were creeping up on them. In terms of adolescence and sexuality, I do need to say that one of the limitations of my research was that I did not interview fathers of adolescents. I had only one father that had children that were with ages between 12 and 15. He has a daughter that was 12 years old at the time of the interview and a son that was 15 years old, but he was separated from his wife. He was living in Romania, but his wife was living in Italy with her new husband. So he had only phone contact with his children, with his daughter, especially, to whom he said he felt more emotionally close to. But the conversations that he described with me were mostly related to telling my daughter to be good and negotiating his relationship with his children by giving them gifts. So there weren't any mentions necessarily of this budding sexual identity that his children might have had. So I would say that that is a wonderful new string for future research, looking at how emotional bordering might be applied for fathers with adolescents, for example, and allowing men to talk about these aspects. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I go to you, Lindsay, as the last question or comment?
Yes, thank you. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I was intrigued by this concept of emotional bordering, and initially I was thinking, is this about a kind of edge or a container? And then it sounded to me as though it's perhaps more about something like maybe a walling off. I wasn't 100% certain, but one of the things that seemed to be coming across was this differentiation between the nurturing approaches of the fathers, and that some were really pretty nurturing, some were kind of medium level nurturing, and some were perhaps not able to be nurturing. And I don't think this was at all the thrust of the research, but I found myself wondering if there was any kind of indication or evidence of what was influencing this readiness or capacity to nurture.
Yeah.
So
Thank you very much.
I wonder if you can make it very brief, please, because we need to move on. But yeah, I'm sorry to be so brutal. Go on.
No worries. Thank you so much. It's a very good question. And I do suggest my book in which I describe at length everything. But I do need to say that I was inspired by Ian Burkitt's idea of emotions as social relations. So he talks there about how we internalize and externalize our emotions, how we express them, but also mull over them in our quiet moments. And I thought that I could apply this really beautiful understanding. I thought it was a theory that spoke so well to the grounded data I was collecting. And that's how I came up with emotional bordering as this, emotions are created in this interrelational space when we interact with each other. And it emerged as well that for men, the men in the sample that I had, love is something that they do. So they do in relation to other people. It's not necessarily just a hidden, mysterious feeling. And indeed, what controlled the bordering were other people's perceptions of them, their partner's perceptions, the space in which they found themselves. Some were more restrictive and stoic at work, in public spaces, than in private spaces. However, others actively rebelled against this and were trying to be more tender in public spaces, just to show that a man can be sensitive and nurturing. So more research is definitely needed. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that.